the most powerful thing you can do in any room is almost nothing. Let that sit for a second. Because everything in our world tells you the opposite. It tells you to speak up, to push back, to make noise, to be loud about who you are, what you want, what you've achieved. Post it, broadcast it, perform it. And yet, when you think of the people you genuinely respect, the ones whose presence changes a room the moment they walk in, the ones whose words land differently, whose silence feels heavier than other people's speeches, they are never the loudest. They are never the most reactive. They are never the ones who feel the need to prove something. They are still, grounded, deliberate. Today, we're going to talk about why that is, where that quality comes from, how it was understood with extraordinary precision by a group of thinkers in ancient Greece and Rome who called themselves Stoics, and how modern neuroscience has caught up to confirm 2,000 years later that they were right. This is not a video about feeling better. It's about becoming different, becoming someone who is harder to shake, easier to trust, and impossible to manipulate. Stay with me. Every part of this builds on the last, and by the end, you will have a complete framework, ancient and modern, for a life that is genuinely free. The invisible war you are already losing. Here is the uncomfortable truth most people never say out loud. You are at war, not with other people, not with the economy, or your circumstances, or the hand you were dealt. You are at war with yourself, with your own reactions, with the part of you that wants to respond before you've thought, that wants to explain itself to people who aren't really listening, that wants to defend, justify, retaliate, and be understood, even when none of those things will actually change anything. And here's what makes it worse. You feel this war most intensely in ordinary moments. Not on a battlefield, not in a boardroom, but at dinner when someone makes a dismissive comment, in a text thread that spirals into something it didn't need to be, in the silence after a meeting where you said something you immediately regretted, in the 2 a.m. thoughts that replay an argument from 3 days ago. The enemy is not out there. The enemy is the part of you that believes your peace of mind depends on winning that argument, that your value depends on other people's recognition, that your future depends on outcomes you cannot control. This is not weakness. This is biology. The human brain is wired by millions of years of evolution to treat social threats exactly like physical ones. When someone disrespects you in public, your nervous system fires the same alarm as if a predator appeared. Your cortisol spikes, your heart rate jumps, your attention narrows, and before your conscious mind has had a single thought, you're already reacting. Neuroscientists call this the amygdala hijack. Your brain's threat detection system fires before your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment, reasoning, and consequence, has had a chance to respond. You are, in that moment, running on evolutionary firmware that has not been updated in a very long time. And most people live there, in that hijacked state, reacting to the world as if every social friction is a survival threat, burning energy on outrage, anxiety, and defense, wondering why they feel exhausted, scattered, and never quite in control of their own lives. The Stoics saw this clearly, not because they had brain scans, but because they were careful observers of human experience. And what they noticed, what they built an entire philosophy around, was this. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response, In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Viktor Frankl, echoing the Stoic tradition. That space, that gap, that pause. That is what this entire video is about. Learning to find it, widen it, and live inside it. Because the person who can do that, consistently, under pressure, in the moments when it matters most, that person has something that no amount of money, status, or talent can buy. They have sovereignty over themselves. Around 300 BC, in a painted porch in Athens called the Stoa Poikile, a merchant named Zeno of Citium began teaching a philosophy of life that was different from everything that came before it. Most philosophy, then and now, concerns itself with questions about the world. What is real? What is true? What is the nature of beauty, justice, or the cosmos? These are fascinating questions. But Zeno asks something more urgent, more personal. How should a human being live? Not in theory, in practice, on a Tuesday morning when everything is going wrong. His followers, the Stoics named after the porch where they gathered, developed a philosophy that was less a set of beliefs and more a set of tools, practical mental technologies for navigating a chaotic, unpredictable world without losing yourself. This philosophy spread across the ancient world and took root in the most unexpected places, among slaves, among senators, and emperors. What held them together was not rank or wealth. It was a shared commitment to a single idea, that your character, your judgment, and your response to the world are the only things that are truly yours. And they are enough. The 3 Stoics you need to know. Epictetus, freedom from the inside. Epictetus was born a slave in the Roman Empire. His master, by some accounts, once twisted his leg in a demonstration of power until it broke. Epictetus reportedly looked at his master calmly and said, "You are going to break it." And when it broke, he said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" That story, whether literally true or not, captures everything about Epictetus. He had no external freedom, but he had cultivated something his master could never touch: complete mastery over his own inner response. He went on to become one of the most celebrated philosophers in the ancient world. People traveled from across the empire to hear him speak, because what he taught was not abstract, it was survival, it was liberation, it was the only freedom that cannot be legislated, taxed, or taken. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius was, by historical measure, the most powerful man in the world. As Emperor of Rome, he commanded millions of soldiers, governed an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, and had the legal authority to do essentially anything he wished. He spent his reign fighting wars he didn't want to fight, managing a plague that killed millions of his citizens, dealing with betrayals from people he trusted, and watching several of his children die before him. Every night he wrote in a private journal, not for publication, not for posterity, for himself. He never intended anyone to read it, and in those pages, which we now call meditations, he wrote not about his victories or his power, but about how to be a better person, how to be patient, how to resist vanity, how to treat the person who wronged you with the same decency you'd want for yourself. That journal is a window into the private practice of a man trying every single day to live according to something higher than his circumstances. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was a playwright, a statesman, and one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He was also exiled or recalled made the tutor of an emperor who later ordered him to kill himself, and forced to comply. What makes Seneca extraordinary is his honesty. He never claimed to be a perfect Stoic. He wrote openly about his own failures, his impatience, his occasional taste for luxury, his fear of death, but he wrote about them precisely because examining them made him better. His letters to his friend Lucilius, written near the end of his life, remain among the most readable and psychologically sharp pieces of philosophy ever produced. He wrote about time with an urgency that feels modern because human anxiety about time is timeless. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. Seneca. 3 very different men. One a slave, one an emperor, one a senator. All of them using the same framework to navigate a world that kept trying to break them. And now, that framework is yours. The 7 pillars of self-mastery. What follows is not a list of tips. It is a system. Each pillar reinforces the others. You can start anywhere, but they are most powerful when you understand how they fit together. Pillar 1, the discipline of perception. Everything begins with how you see things. Not what happens to you, but what you make of it. The Stoics had a concept they called phantasia, the impression that an event makes on your mind. When something happens, your mind automatically generates an impression. This is dangerous. This is an insult. This is a disaster. The Stoic practice was to pause before accepting that impression as true, to examine it, to ask, is this actually what's happening? Or is this my mind's first unexamined reaction? Marcus Aurelius wrote that nearly everything we experience as painful is painful not in itself, but in our interpretation of it. A traffic jam is not an obstacle to your peace. Your resistance to the traffic jam is. An insult from a colleague is not a wound. Your decision to accept it as one is. This is not denial. It is not pretending things don't happen. It is the recognition that the same event, job loss, rejection, illness, failure, can be experienced as catastrophe by one person and as information by another. The difference is not luck. It is trained perception. Modern psychology has a name for this: cognitive reappraisal. It is one of the most robustly studied emotional regulation strategies in the literature. Studies by James Gross at Stanford show that people who regularly practice reappraising stressful events, consciously choosing a different interpretation, show lower physiological stress responses, lower cortisol levels, and better long-term emotional health than people who simply suppress their reactions. The Stoics were doing cognitive reappraisal 2 millennia before the Stanford Psychology Department existed. The practice is simple but demanding. The next time something upsets you, before you react, ask one question. Is this objectively as bad as it feels right now? Almost always, the answer is no. And that 1-second pause, that recognition, is the beginning of everything else. The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. R. Marcus Aurelius. Pillar 2, the dichotomy of control. This is the bedrock of Stoic philosophy, the foundation on which everything else is built. And it is also the principle that most people intellectually understand and almost no one actually practices. The Stoics divided all of human experience into 2 categories, and they were absolute about this division. On one side, things within your control. Your judgments, your intentions, your effort, your values, your responses. On the other side, everything else. Other people's opinions, the weather, markets, whether your flight is delayed, whether the person you love loves you back, whether you get the promotion. Here is the principle, in Epictetus' own words, from the opening line of his Enchiridion, his handbook for life. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Epictetus. Now, before we go further, I need to address something, because this principle is often misunderstood as passivity, as giving up, as an excuse not to try. It is the opposite. The dichotomy of control is not about withdrawing from the world. It is about directing your effort with maximum efficiency. Every calorie of mental and emotional energy you spend worrying about something outside your control is a calorie stolen from what you can actually change. Every hour of anxiety about other people's opinions is an hour not spent improving yourself. Every night of rumination about the past is a night not spent preparing for tomorrow. Self-determination theory, one of the most widely cited frameworks in motivational psychology, tells us that people flourish when they feel a sense of autonomy, competence, and connection. But research consistently shows that people who anchor their sense of autonomy to internal standards, their own effort, their own values, are significantly more resilient to setbacks than those who anchor it to external outcomes. In plain language, if your goal is to get a promotion and you don't get it, you have failed. If your goal is to do the best work you are capable of, you cannot fail. The outcome is outside your control. The quality of your effort is not. This is what Stoics mean when they talk about preferred indifference. They are not saying the outcome doesn't matter. Of course you'd prefer the promotion. Of course you'd prefer to win. But you release the attachment to the outcome, because attachment to what you cannot control is the direct cause of anxiety, resentment, and suffering. And you focus entirely on the inputs, because those are yours. The practice. Write 2 columns, what I can control, what I cannot. For every source of stress in your life right now, place it in 1 column. Then make a decision. Everything in the right column gets no more mental energy. Everything in the left column gets your full, undivided attention. Pillar 3. The examined life. Socrates, whose philosophical descendants the Stoics considered themselves, famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. The Stoics built an entire practice around this idea. They called it the evening review. Every night, Seneca wrote, you should account for your day, not in a spirit of self-punishment, not to generate guilt or shame, but with the honest curiosity of a scientist reviewing experimental data. What did you do well? What did you do poorly? Where did you act in alignment with your values? And where did you betray them? Not to judge yourself, but to know yourself. Because you cannot improve what you do not understand. I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. Seneca. This practice has a modern parallel in a concept called metacognition, the capacity to think about your own thinking. Research from Harvard Business School by Giada Di Stefano and others shows that people who spend time reflecting on their experiences, even as little as 15 minutes per day, learn significantly faster and perform significantly better than those who simply accumulate experience without reflection. Experience alone does not create wisdom. Examined experience does. The Stoic Evening Review is not journaling for therapeutic comfort. It is a quality control system for your own character. You are asking yourself every single day, was I the person I intend to be? And if not, what specifically went wrong, and what will I do differently tomorrow? This turns every day, including the bad ones, into data. It turns every mistake into a teacher. And it means that over months and years, you are not the same person you were. You are measurably, concretely, verifiably better. The practice: 10 minutes before sleep. 3 questions. What did I do well today? Where did I fall short of my own standard? What is one specific thing I will do differently tomorrow? That's it. Keep it simple. Keep it consistent. The consistency is everything. Pillar 4. The architecture of desire. Here is a question most people never think to ask. What do you actually want? Not the surface answer. Not the things you're supposed to want. The salary, the title, the recognition, the body, the relationship. But underneath all of that, what are you actually pursuing? Because the Stoics noticed something that behavioral economists have now confirmed with centuries of data, humans are extraordinarily bad at predicting what will make them happy. We overinvest in external goals, acquiring things, achieving status, getting approval, and systematically underinvest in internal states, meaning integrity, connection. The phenomenon has a name in modern psychology: affective forecasting error. We are wrong, consistently and predictably wrong, about how good the good things will feel when we get them, and how bad the bad things will feel when they happen. The promotion feels less satisfying than we anticipated. The loss hurts less than we feared. The Stoics had already worked this out. They called it the architecture of desire, the recognition that most human suffering comes not from not getting what we want, but from wanting the wrong things. Their solution was elegantly simple: desire only what is within your control, primarily your own character and virtue. Everything else pursue as a preference, not a necessity. Want the job, work hard for it, but do not need it for your peace of mind, because your peace of mind is yours and it does not depend on any outcome. Marcus Aurelius described this as the reserve clause, always holding your goals with the mental footnote: if nothing prevents it, I will finish this project. If nothing prevents it, I will be healthy. If nothing prevents it, I will build this relationship. If nothing prevents it. Not pessimism, not defeatism, just the honest recognition that the world is not obligated to cooperate with your plans. And the person who can hold their desires lightly, who can want things without being owned by them, that person is free in a way that no external circumstance can compromise. The practice: for your 3 biggest current goals, ask yourself honestly, if I don't achieve this, does my fundamental sense of self remain intact? If the answer is no, you have attached your identity to an outcome. That attachment is the source of your anxiety, not the goal itself. There is a profound misconception about Stoicism that I want to address directly, because it is one of the most damaging. People assume that Stoicism is about becoming emotionally detached, cold, self-contained, an island of composure in a sea of chaos, an individual fortress. This is completely, fundamentally wrong. The Stoics were deeply, even radically, committed to human community. They developed a concept called oikeosis, a Greek word that roughly translates as belonging or affiliation. The idea is that every human being has an expanding circle of concern, from yourself to your family to your community, to your city, to all of humanity. Modern research in positive psychology has converged on something the Stoics knew intuitively: self-transcendence. The experience of contributing to something larger than yourself is one of the most reliable predictors of what researchers call eudaimonic well-being. Not the shallow pleasure of getting what you want, but the deep satisfaction of living with purpose. Martin Seligman's PERMA model: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, places meaning and relationships at the center of flourishing. Not achievement, not wealth. Meaning, relationships, both of which require you to turn outward. The Stoic practice of action is this: in everything you do, ask whether you are acting only for yourself or whether your action serves something beyond you. The doctor who practices medicine with genuine care for the patient. The parent who shows up for their children even when it's inconvenient. The colleague who does the unglamorous work that makes the team function. The friend who tells the uncomfortable truth. This is not about self-sacrifice or martyrdom. It is about recognizing that a life turned entirely inward is, by definition, a smaller life. And a life that extends outward, that genuinely invests in others, is the only kind that the research and the ancient texts both agree actually satisfies. Pillar 6, voluntary hardship and the training of the will. We live in the most comfortable era in human history: temperature-controlled environments, on-demand food, frictionless entertainment, 2-day shipping, instant answers, constant stimulation. And something strange has happened alongside all this comfort. We have become more anxious, not less, more fragile, not more resilient, more dependent on our comforts, and more distressed when they're unavailable. The Stoics would not be surprised. They understood something about the human organism that most modern people resist. We are built for difficulty, the capacity to endure hardship, to function well under discomfort, uncertainty, and scarcity is not just a nice quality to have. It is a fundamental component of a functioning human being. When we lose it through disuse, we become fragile in ways that go far beyond the physical. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, regularly chose to sleep on a hard floor, to eat the coarsest food available, to wear rough clothing in winter, not because he lacked the means for luxury, precisely because he had it. He was training himself not to need it. Let us become intimate with poverty, so that fortune may not catch us off our guard. Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with this scantiest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" The neuroscience here is striking. Research on hormetic stress, the phenomenon where small doses of a stressor make an organism more robust, shows that regular exposure to manageable discomfort builds physiological and psychological resilience. Cold exposure, intermittent fasting, effortful physical training, deliberate social risk-taking, all of these produce measurable changes in the nervous system's capacity to handle adversity. Your comfort zone, if never challenged, does not stay the same size. It shrinks, and the things you once handled easily begin to feel overwhelming. Conversely, the practice of deliberately choosing discomfort, of regularly doing hard things that you don't have to do, expands your tolerance, builds your confidence, and gives you a direct, embodied experience of your own capability. That experience cannot be given to you by a motivational speech. It cannot be absorbed from a book. It has to be earned through the body, through action, through the actual decision to do the thing you'd rather avoid. The practice here is simple, but requires commitment. Every day, do one thing you would normally skip because it's uncomfortable. A cold shower, an honest conversation you've been postponing, an extra mile when your body says stop, silence when you'd prefer to scroll, fasting from something that has become a crutch. Start small. The goal is not to suffer. The goal is to prove to yourself daily that you are not owned by your preferences, that you can choose, that the discomfort will not break you, that on the other side of it, you are slightly more free than you were before. Pillar 7, memento mori. Let death clarify everything. We have arrived at the hardest principle, the one most people resist, the one that, once genuinely absorbed, changes everything. You are going to die. This is not a morbid observation. It is the most important fact about your life. And the reason most people never think about it clearly is that the culture we live in is extraordinarily good at helping us avoid it. In ancient Rome, when a victorious general returned from war and paraded through the city, flowers, crowds, triumph, there was a slave whose only job was to ride beside him and whisper in his ear throughout the entire celebration. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. Memento mori. Not to ruin the moment, to complete it, to remind the general that this glory, like all glory, was temporary, that the crowd cheering today would not remember him in a century, that his power, his victories, his very name, all of it would eventually return to dust. And in that reminder, that's where the meaning lived. Seneca wrote with extraordinary force about what he called the squandering of time. His essay on the shortness of life is not about death being frightening. It is about life being wasted. About people who are extraordinarily careful with their money, who would never throw coins in the street, but who throw years away without a second thought. Years spent on work they don't believe in, relationships that diminish them, entertainment that fills time without feeding anything. You act like mortals in all that you fear, and like immortals in all that you desire. The research on mortality salience, the psychological study of how thinking about death affects behavior, is fascinating. Terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg and colleagues, shows that when people are reminded of their mortality, they generally become more defensive of their worldview, more tribal, and more acquisitive, more anxious, more desperate to leave a legacy. But there is a crucial exception. People who have genuinely integrated the reality of death, who have sat with it, not avoided it, show a different pattern. They become calmer, more focused on what actually matters to them, less affected by trivial social friction, more courageous, more present. This is what the Stoics knew. The practice of memento mori is not about anxiety. It is about clarification. It is asking, if I knew this was one of my last days, would I spend it this way? Would I hold this resentment? Would I skip this conversation with someone I love? Would I spend 2 hours arguing about something I won't remember in a month? Most of what we agonize over does not survive the filter of mortality. And what does survive, what remains when you hold it against the fact of your finitude, that is what actually matters. That is where your energy belongs. The practice, once a week, spend 5 minutes with this question. If today were my last day, would I be at peace with how I lived it? Not whether everything went right, whether you lived it with intention, whether you showed up for the people and the work that actually matter to you, If the answer is no, then today is your opportunity to change that answer. The architecture of a Stoic day. Everything we've covered is powerful in theory, but philosophy that stays in theory is not philosophy. It is decoration. The Stoics understood this. They were not interested in ideas that sounded good at dinner parties. They were interested in ideas that worked at 3 a.m. when the crisis came. At the moment of loss, at the point of provocation, in the boardroom, in the courtroom, in the bedroom, in the hospital. So let me give you a concrete architecture, a daily structure that builds these principles into your life without requiring you to overhaul everything at once. Because sustainable change is incremental, and the goal is not to have one good day. It is to build a different kind of person. Morning, the premeditatio malorum, before you check your phone, before the notifications and the news and the demands of the day flood in. Spend 10 minutes in what the Stoics called the premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Sit quietly and ask, what difficulties am I likely to face today? Not to generate anxiety about them, but to prepare your mind. The Stoics discovered, and modern research on mental simulation confirms, that imagining challenges in advance activates the same neural pathways as actually experiencing them. You are, in a very real sense, running a rehearsal. And people who have mentally rehearsed adversity respond more calmly and more effectively when the real event arrives. You might encounter someone who is rude or unreasonable. You might face an unexpected setback. Plans might change. Something you were counting on might fall through. How will you respond when that happens? Not if, when. The answer you prepare in the morning becomes the response you give in the moment. And that response, consistently chosen, is your character. Marcus Aurelius kept a mental list of what he called irritants, the people and situations that most reliably provoked his worst impulses. He wrote about them honestly. The flatterer, the critic, the person who talks too much, the colleague who takes credit, the bureaucrat who creates obstacles. And he wrote about his practice, to see each of these people not as enemies, but as teachers. Every irritant is an opportunity to practice. Every provocation is a chance to ask, will I respond from my amygdala or from my prefrontal cortex? From my evolutionary firmware or from the values I have chosen? The neuroscientific practice is called affect labeling, the act of naming what you're feeling in real time. Research by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA shows that simply labeling an emotion, I'm feeling frustrated right now, measurably reduces the intensity of that emotion by activating the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and dampening amygdala activity. You are literally neurologically shifting from the reactive brain to the thinking brain just by naming what you feel. This is the pause. This is the gap between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl described. This is where you live, or where you could live, if you practice. We've already covered the Stoic Evening Review, but let me add something the Stoics emphasize that often gets lost. This practice is not for self-punishment. Seneca was explicit about this. When you find that you fell short today, that you reacted when you meant to respond, that you said something you regret, that you failed to live up to your own standard, the appropriate response is not guilt. Guilt is indulgent. It keeps you focused on yourself, on your failure, on the wound to your pride. The appropriate response is acknowledgement, learning, and the next action. That is all. Acknowledge what happened, understand why, decide what you'll do differently, and move forward. The Stoics called this the discipline of the will, not the will to keep choosing every day who you are going to be, regardless of whether you succeeded yesterday, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. Marcus Aurelius. What neuroscience says about Stoic practice? Let me take a few minutes to go deeper on the science, because I think it matters. Not because ancient wisdom needs to be validated by modern research. It has already been validated by 2,000 years of human lives. But because understanding the mechanism helps you use the tool better. The default mode network and the wandering mind. When your mind is not actively engaged with a task, it defaults to what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when you are thinking about yourself, your past, your future, and other people. This network is responsible for self-referential thought. What does this mean for me? What might happen? What did that person mean by that? Research by Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert in a landmark study published in Science showed that the human mind wanders roughly 47% of waking hours. And during those wandering moments, people report lower happiness than during moments of focused engagement, regardless of what they're actually doing. The Stoics built their practices. The morning review, the evening review, the focus on present action, the return to what is within your control. As a form of default mode network management, they were, without knowing the neuroscience, training themselves to spend less time in unfocused self-referential rumination and more time in directed, purposeful thought. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain behind your forehead, is the seat of what psychologists call executive function. Planning, reasoning, impulse control, the ability to hold a goal in mind and resist short-term temptation in service of it. It is, in many ways, the neurological substrate of what the Stoics meant by reason. And, crucially, it is trainable. Research on cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and deliberate emotional regulation practice all show that consistent practice produces measurable changes in prefrontal cortex thickness, activity, and connection to other brain regions. You are literally building different hardware through practice. The Stoic practices, the premeditatio, the evening review, the deliberate pause before response, the reappraisal of events, are all, from a neuroscientific perspective, prefrontal cortex training. They are exercises in executive function, and, like all exercises, they build capacity over time. One of the most important insights from behavioral neuroscience is the role of dopamine, not just in reward, but in anticipation. The dopamine system is activated not primarily by getting what you want, but by the expectation of getting it. This is why social media is so compelling. Every scroll might produce a reward, and the unpredictability of that reward is precisely what keeps the system activated. The modern attention economy is, at its core, a dopamine economy. Every notification, every like, every share is a small dopamine hit, and the architects of these systems know it. They are exploiting your biology to sell your attention. The Stoic response to this is not to denounce technology. It is to practice voluntary independence from it. To regularly choose the longer time horizon, to invest in things, relationships, skills, character, that pay dividends over years rather than milliseconds. The research on delayed gratification, from Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow studies to follow-up work over decades, consistently shows that the capacity to delay gratification is one of the strongest predictors of life outcomes across domains: academic performance, physical health, financial stability, quality of relationships. Not intelligence, not talent, the capacity to choose the longer game. Stoic practice is delayed gratification training at the level of character. Every time you choose the harder right over the easier wrong, you are building that capacity. Every time you invest in virtue over approval, in integrity over convenience, in presence over distraction, you are making a deposit in an account that compounds. We've covered a great deal of ground today: perception, control, reflection, desire, service, hardship, mortality, the morning practice, the daily pause, the evening review, the neuroscience of composure, and the ancient wisdom behind it. But I want to end with something that I think is more important than any individual principle. The Stoics were not trying to produce people who never felt anything. They were not advocates of emotional flatness, cold detachment, or performative indifference. Read Marcus Aurelius carefully, and you will find a man who grieved deeply, who loved his children, who felt the weight of responsibility acutely, who was moved by beauty and by suffering. What they were trying to produce, what Stoicism at its best actually produces, is something different. A person who can feel everything and be controlled by nothing, who can grieve without being consumed, who can love without being destroyed by the possibility of loss, who can fail without losing their sense of self, who can be wronged without becoming the wrong. That is an extraordinarily high standard. No one achieves it perfectly. Marcus Aurelius didn't. Seneca didn't. Epictetus, who came closest, wrote about his own failures with the same honesty as his insights. The point is not perfection. The point is direction. The point is that every day, every single day, you have the choice to move slightly closer to that person or slightly further away. And those daily choices, aggregated over months and years, produce someone who is unmistakably different from who they were. The world you live in will keep generating friction. It will keep offering provocations, disappointments, injustices. It will keep testing whether your peace of mind is genuinely yours or whether it is on loan from your circumstances. The Stoic answer, the answer that is held across 2,000 years, across slavery and empire, across plague and war, across the full spectrum of human fortune, is this: the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Marcus Aurelius. The obstacle is not in your way. The obstacle is the way. Every difficulty you encounter is an invitation to practice. Every provocation is an exam. Every loss is a lesson. Every moment of discomfort is a doorway to a stronger version of yourself. You cannot be broken by what you have already decided cannot break you. Decide now, practice daily, and come back to this when you forget. Because you will forget. Everyone does. That's why the Stoics wrote it down. That's why Marcus Aurelius returned to the same truths, in different words, hundreds of times across the pages of his private journal. Not because he hadn't understood them, but because understanding fades without practice, and practice fades without reminding. So save this video, share it with someone who needs it, and then, most importantly, go do something hard today, something you'd normally skip, not because it matters what it is, but because the act of choosing difficulty, choosing the longer game over the easier one, that act, done daily, is how the Stoics built themselves into the people history still talks about. And it is how you build the person the rest of your life is waiting for. That's all for today. I'll see you in the next one.